Hello and welcome back to Paddock in Track, the show where we bring you news on and off the track. My name is Amaan and I'm joined as always by my co-host Max.
Hi guys.
And today we bring you the United States Grand Prix.
Yes, and it was an exciting one, I would say.
I think so, yeah.
The sprint was in some ways a little bit less so, but it was still a very exciting race. We see Verstappen on pole, so that Red Bull storm seems to be kind of coming back to them.
Yes, we have.
And Russell starting in second, so a very good start for him. That Mercedes, we talked about it in the past, but the Mercedes is getting a lot better.
Yep.
In some races, they looked a lot faster than the Red Bulls, and in some cases even than the McLarens and the Ferraris. So
Yes.
that's important. And then Leclerc in P3,
Yes.
so another really good for Ferrari. They're starting to sort of make back some of the headway that they haven't had in recent times, which is very important for their title fight with McLaren.
Yeah, we have Lando Norris in P4, splitting the two Ferraris with Carlos Sainz in P5. So we see Lando Norris in that McLaren. Seems to be that the competition's catching back up to McLaren right here. But it seems to be that they're still sort of at the top as well.
Yeah. And then we see Hamilton down in P7, and he is surrounded by the two Haas's.
Yes.
Hülkenberg in 6th, Magnussen in 8th. And I think that's really important to note here because Haas has been having a pretty good season recently.
Yes.
We've seen them have some very strong qualifying performances recently, especially from Hülkenberg, but even from Magnussen too.
Yeah.
And they've been picking up some really, really solid points hauls. And this is really helping them in their fight, especially with teams like Alpine and Williams. So it's very helpful for them. And then Tsunoda in P9, so a Q3 result for him. It's a little different in the sprint qualifying, but still, P9 is very good for them. Of course, it's not points when you're in the sprint. Only 1st through 8th get points, but that's still something.
And we see Franco Colapinto sneaking into the top 10 in that Williams car. I mean, for a new racer, he's doing pretty well for himself, and especially in that Williams car, which has been historically slow.
Well, and he's ahead of Perez in 11th, so that's something.
Well, yeah.
And ahead of his teammate Alex Albon, but of course Albon was forced to start from the pit lane. And then we're looking down the rest of the grid. The only thing that's really surprising is Oscar Piastri down in 16th, which is not great for McLaren's fight for the Constructors' title.
Yeah.
At this point, it's less so with Red Bull and more just with Ferrari, but that's still something. So then, getting into the sprint, Russell loses places very early to Norris and Leclerc. Norris actually has a pretty good start, which is sort of uncharacteristic for him. But Russell and Leclerc both have a pretty good start, and they both get past Russell early. So maybe that Mercedes isn't quite there. It could have been just Russell not being the best at starting.
Yeah.
But also maybe that the Mercedes, is not quite there. We did see him fighting back up to try and get past Leclerc, but he was sort of struggling a little bit, especially early.
But I think that the Ferraris did have really good race pace this weekend. I mean, we've seen them also fight each other quite a bit during the sprint as well for 4th and 5th place.
Yeah, that was a really interesting fight to watch just because, of course, they're in the same car.
Yeah.
And they looked fairly evenly matched, which, again, brings the question to my head of why they're dropping signs. Of course, you're gaining Lewis Hamilton, right? So on the one hand, it's like, then it kind of makes sense when you put it in that light. But when you see him compared to Leclerc, they were both holding their ground, and Sainz ends up ahead of Leclerc at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so it brings that question to me of why exactly are they dropping Sainz when you have them directly competing against each other?
Exactly.
And they're doing pretty evenly, they're doing pretty similar pace, and they're fighting pretty evenly. It just seems like silly to drop him still.
It is. I think so as well. But even then, you're still getting the 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton as well. So I don't think it's a total loss. But it's only time can tell. We'll see next season how much Hamilton does bring to the table for Ferrari, and then we can actively compare them as well.
We also see Russell getting passed by both of the Ferraris. Again, like I said, I feel like Russell seemed to be struggling a little bit in this race. At the end of the day, he's still 5th place, so it's not terrible. But he was clearly not as fast as those two Ferraris.
I just think that the Mercedes is just, maybe it was just a better qualifying for Russell this time around, but I don't think the Mercedes is there quite yet to catch the Ferraris and the McLarens.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and Piastri was, we saw Piastri fighting his way up through the grid. And he was actually, I would say, doing a pretty good job of making his way up the grid.
Yeah.
But he ended up getting a 5-second penalty for forcing Gasly off the track.
So, yeah.
So ultimately, that was not probably his best move, but I mean he still ended up in 10th place, so it's not terrible for him.
Yeah.
Considering where he started down in 16th, that's a decent way to make up, especially in only 19 laps in the sprint race.
And then in true Lando Norris fashion, he bottles the end of the sprint to Carlos Sainz by locking up.
Yeah. He had held on to P2 for a long time.
Yeah.
And once the two Ferraris kind of stopped fighting each other so much, Sainz seemed to have a lot more pace.
Yeah.
And Leclerc did too, honestly, but they both started to catch Norris pretty quickly. And Norris, I mean, I think all of their tires were starting to go ish. But Norris he made a mistake. He just locked up, and there was nothing. It was unforced. He's feeling the pressure, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, like that's a kind of a mistake you should be able to avoid, especially at this point in your career.
Yeah.
But I mean, he still ends up P3, so there could be worse things.
He could have been passed by Leclerc too as well.
Yeah, so a solid points haul, especially for Norris, as he looks to maybe make some waves in that drivers' championship. We've talked about it before, whether his chances are real or not. I still feel like they're kind of slim, just looking at the points gap, but we'll see as the season goes on. We've only got a couple races left, so we'll see. And the rest of the grid, in terms of the finishing order of the sprint, is ultimately not very surprising. Magnussen and Hülkenberg both picking up points in 7th and 8th, so that's 3 points there for Haas. Perez only not picking up any points. He made up a couple places, but still only 9th place. And then Piastri, as we said, making his way up to 10th, which is good for him. But yeah, otherwise the grid was not, or the final result was
like
not
out of
great.
the ordinary. Yeah.
And then getting into the race now, we see Norris on pole. So a bit of a different qualifying in this case, but part of that was because Russell had crashed in qualifying. So, of course, that didn't help him, so we can't really get a true grasp of his pace. But Norris up at the top, Verstappen in second. So Verstappen not as fast, at least over a single lap, as that McLaren.
Yeah.
And then we see Sainz and Leclerc, P3 and P4 respectively.
Ferrari's still doing good.
Yeah, so Ferrari seems very strong so far this weekend.
Yeah.
They were fast in the sprint, and they were quick-ish in qualifying. Of course, they're not on pole. They're not on second place.
They were definitely quicker during the race, I think.
Yeah. And then we see Gasly in P6. So very impressive qualifying from him in that Alpine. We've seen him have some recent success.
Yeah.
He's been doing actually pretty good in recent times.
Hopefully that turns a corner for that Alpine team.
Yeah, I think you really have to give him credit for the work he's been doing.
Yeah.
We've not been seeing the same kind of performance from Ocon. And I think this really shows how good of a driver Gasly really is. I think a lot of people don't always see that about Gasly. He kind of sticks in the background sometimes, but he's been doing, I think, a really, really good job this season.
Well, to be fair, he's also been on teams that have been like back burner teams. Like he's been on AlphaTauri as his first, and then he also went to Alpine after that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you have to consider Ocon has too. He's basically been with Renault his entire career. He was with Force India for a bit, but most of the time he's been with Renault.
Yeah.
And so, he's been on teams that are not necessarily at the front. Of course, when he was with Force India or Racing Point, they were somewhat competitive. I think there was times in there where we saw like Perez having some really good results. So you look at Bahrain when Perez had his brilliant drive coming all the way from last to first. But really, I would say that he wasn't on like a front runner team, Ocon. He never got to like the Red Bulls or the Ferraris.
No.
We'll see what he does next season with Haas, but I think he's really been on those kind of back marker teams for his whole career. So same with Gasly.
Yeah.
And I think Gasly this year is getting his first taste of something that's a little more competitive. The AlphaTauri has never really been all that competitive.
No, not really at all.
And then looking down the rest of the grid, Alonso in 7th, so that Aston Martin is not completely off the table. I think it's something to keep an eye on. And then Magnussen in 8th and Hülkenberg in 11th. So Hülkenberg out in Q2, but Magnussen into Q3.
Yeah.
And even Hülkenberg out in Q2, I mean, he's still P11. That's a very good result from him. That's the top of Q2, of course. And then we see Perez made it into Q3, so very exciting for him in P9. And then Tsunoda behind him in P10. So, again, a good result for Tsunoda, a good qualifying for him for both the sprint and the race, especially in that V-Carb that's not really a fast car.
Yeah, but we also see that Perez barely could get past that RB car, even though he is in that Red Bull. So he still struggles continue for Perez.
Yeah, and then as we look down the rest of the grid, nothing very exciting. Nothing really jumps out.
Hamilton P17. That's what sticks out.
But that is about it. We see a couple of penalties. Joe gets a 5-place grid penalty. Lawson required to start from the back of the grid because he took power unit elements, and then Russell starting from the pit lane after his crash in qualifying. Getting into the start, this was a very hectic start.
Yes.
Norris actually finally got a very good start off the line, I would say.
But then he didn't complete the start.
Yeah, I think he just didn't cut off Verstappen fast enough. Going into that first corner at Coda, it's so wide. It's such a big corner. And he just left the door wide open for Max. And to Norris's credit, Max did probably force him off a little more than he needed to. There wasn't really much space for Norris on the track. In fact, there was no space on the track, as I think Verstappen was up on that outside curb.
Yeah.
But, I think Norris had the opportunity to close the door on Max, and he just didn't. He wasn't aggressive enough. Yeah. And then that let Leclerc go past through that first corner. Leclerc then goes into the lead, and he really held on to that lead for most of the race. Excluding the pit stop period, he was pretty much in the lead the entire race, and that was really impressive. Very dominant from Leclerc.
Yeah, but it was really good for Leclerc, but unfortunate also for Norris, who dropped all the way to P4 as well. So had Carlos Sainz also pass him.
Yes.
So very unfortunate for him.
And also an unfortunate start for Esteban Ocon, as Alex Albon hits him at the beginning and just spins him around and did that turn one. That's obviously unfortunate. You never want to get spun around, especially on the first lap. It's always a chaotic start, but that first corner it's so huge. It's hard to hit someone. I don't know. And then we see Hamilton beach his car.
Oh, yeah, but not only that, he spun on the same part George Russell crashed in qualifying. So teammates making the same mistake at the same corner.
Yeah, there must be a magnet in that gravel trap that only attracts Mercedes cars, because it was honestly, again, another unforced error. It seems like a common trend at this track. But yeah, I mean, he just lost the back end of the car, got a lot of oversteer, and he just spun it, and then he got beached. I mean,
it's unfortunate to get beached though.
Yeah, it's a sad way to go out of the race. But it was kind of a silly incident to me. Yeah. Just because it's Lewis Hamilton, right? 7-time world champion. He's been in the sport for years upon years, and I get that things happen, right? And it's not necessarily his fault. But I feel like he should know a little better at this point how to feel out the car and things like that. He shouldn't have problems like this.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just my opinion.
But that, interestingly enough, though, that is the first safety car since the Canadian Grand Prix. So it's
very exciting.
I heard it was the longest time since, I think it was 2003.
It's very exciting for Burt Mylander. He can finally do his job.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we finally get a safety car. Bunches up the grid, but Leclerc manages to get a very good getaway.
So I think that's just a really good performance by Leclerc.
Yeah. Throughout the race, I think it was a very good performance.
Yeah, he didn't let the safety car affect how his race went, and he did a really good job holding Verstappen off.
Yeah. I mean, Verstappen really didn't stand a chance at that restart, and then he just fell back.
Yeah.
I really think that the Ferrari was the best car this race.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, and really, Verstappen didn't stand much of a chance. He stood somewhat of a chance, but he didn't stand much of a chance.
Well, I also think that Ferrari's strategy was also very on point as well.
It was.
I mean, there was Sainz's strategy was that they were supposed to undercut, and the undercut worked to perfection, and that got him all the way up to P2.
P2 at the end of the race, yeah. Uncharacteristically for Ferrari, they had a strategy car workout, but yeah, it was very good. It was kind of a masterclass by Ferrari.
It was.
They really did a very good job.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see the hard tires being not very good.
No.
The people who were running on those hard tires were not having very good luck. Hamilton spun on the hards. Stroll was falling back on those hards, and Lawson was just kind of meh.
Well, I mean, Stroll. I mean,
it's hard to compare with Stroll. Yeah. But and then we saw Russell take on those hards, and he was kind of just doing okay.
Yeah.
He wasn't doing great. He wasn't doing horrible, but it wasn't it wasn't what you want to see from Russell, especially starting in last effectively.
Yeah.
Most people were running on those mediums, and they seemed to be working a lot better.
Yeah.
And then Sainz said that the car was smelling like fuel, but all the way on lap 10, and then they just like stopped talking about it.
Yeah.
So
was I concerned maybe?
Yeah, I would have been concerned personally.
Yeah.
But usually the car isn't supposed to smell like fuel. But it seemed like it wasn't too big of a problem.
Well, it didn't seem like a problem because I don't think the car burst into flames either.
It did not.
So
if the car's not on fire, it must be fine.
Yeah.
And then. So then eventually that kind of just went away as a problem for them.
Yeah.
And then later we see the McLarens having a somewhat more interesting strategy. Mm-hmm. They were trying to sort of do the overcut, so staying out longer and then having fresher tires at the end. It almost worked. Almost worked. Norris just needed to get past Verstappen at the end.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that in a minute here, but that was Norris's problem, is that he wasn't fast enough.
Yeah, I think that also this strategy, I think McLaren has also used a lot this season. I feel like they've kept their drivers out for a long period of time to see if they can gain that advantage because they've had the car to do it. But this time around, it didn't really work out at all. I mean, as we saw, that Norris was trying to fight off Verstappen at the end of the race, but which we'll talk about in a second as well.
Yeah, and I will say he was. I think Norris's problem was like he wasn't fast enough soon enough.
No,
is what I think. I'm thinking is that he was fast, and once he finally got past Verstappen, he was quicker. But he had a penalty, which we'll talk about. So yeah, we'll get into that in a minute here. And so then we see the beginning of the penalties. Gasly gains a 5-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. This was, of course, after I didn't mention George Russell's penalty towards the beginning of the race. But Gasly gains a penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. Then Tsunoda gets a penalty for forcing Alex Albon off the track.
Yeah.
Not great for Tsunoda, especially who could use some points. Lawson is not helping a ton. We'll talk about Lawson a little more in a bit. But I think Tsunoda's really carrying the team. We've seen that a lot throughout the season.
Yeah, I know.
When Ricciardo was still on the team and now with Lawson, it seems like Tsunoda's kind of the one who's rowing the boat, so to speak, and no one's really helping him out. And then we see, so now if we want to get into that Norris and Verstappen fight, so last couple laps of the Grand Prix, honestly, I think Norris just had to be quicker and get past Verstappen sooner.
Yeah.
It led eventually to an incident where Norris was forced wide, and honestly,
I think it's something that can go either way.
Yeah. I think the problem is that so Norris got pushed off the track and then he overtook Verstappen off the track. So Verstappen was on the track and Norris just kept going off the track and then eventually rejoined, but he passed Verstappen off the track. So, in my opinion, I think he should have just given the place back and then kept fighting, and maybe he would have gained the position anyways. I think the strategy he went with, which was to just stay ahead and try and make a 5-second gap, was not what he should have done.
It was really, I think, puts more pressure on Norris to gain that 5 seconds, because 5 seconds is a long time, and Norris could have thought of something better than that.
Yeah.
But also, I think, going into that penalty itself, I think Verstappen was still ahead at the apex. I think that's what it was.
It was tricky to say who was ahead. In my opinion, it makes sense to give them a penalty because at the end of the day, Norris was off the track and he overtook Verstappen. Right?
Yeah,
that's reasonable.
Yeah.
But what I think is the problem is that Norris seemed to have a lot of pace. Once he got into the clear air, he had a lot of pace. I mean, he built up almost a 4-second gap over the course of like 1 or 2 laps.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the 5 seconds that he needed. I think part of the problem is Coda itself. This track is hard to overtake at. You really get one good opportunity and it's down that main straight. At the same time, I feel like it's partly Norris's fault. Just because there's one like really good overtaking spot doesn't mean that there's not other overtaking spots.
Yeah.
And I think he just needed to be that little bit faster. And part of it comes down to how you manage your energy, right? These modern F1 cars are so based on their energy recovery systems.
Yeah.
That we've seen applied in a lot of other sports. Now you have things like in WEC, the World Endurance Championship, as well as the World Rally Championship. energy systems being used, and actually they're removing it in WRC, but that's a whole different conversation. But I think that energy management is so important, and I think it's hard to say exactly what Lando was doing, but it seemed like maybe his energy management was just not quite on point, or his pace was just not quite there, because he should have been able to pass Verstappen faster. Of course, we know Verstappen's a good defender.
Yeah.
But at the same time, once he got past Verstappen, like, where was all this pace that Norris suddenly had?
Yeah.
Like, where was this the whole time he was behind Verstappen? It's hard to say. But it was an interesting couple laps there with that fight between Norris and Verstappen.
Yeah, but I think it was just a good. It was good. Also, good defense by the 3-time world champion too.
It was,
by Max Verstappen.
Yeah. And then getting into that finishing order, we see Leclerc on top. So again, like we said, a pretty dominant weekend for Leclerc, and then Carlos Sainz in P2. So a very good weekend for Ferrari.
Yes.
A 1-2 for them in the United States, something they have not achieved for a very long time.
This puts them right on the doorstep of P2 in the constructor standings, right about to pass Red Bull. I think they're about 8 points behind them.
Yeah.
So it's going to be really interesting to see these last few races what Ferrari can do. I mean, I think it's inevitable at this point, considering how Perez has been performing lately.
Well, and we see Verstappen doing good and still gaining those points for Red Bull, but yeah, you're right. Perez is just not picking up his part of the work.
It's a 2v1 right now, so it's about when Ferrari's going to pass rather than if.
Yeah, so we see, in this race specifically, we see Verstappen in P3, Perez down in P7, so not picking up a lot of points for them. Norris in P4, so again, we talked about that, but that's not helping him and his chances for the constructors, McLaren's chances in the constructors, nor his chances in the drivers' championships. So that's not great for him. But Piastri and P5, so those two are working well as a team to gain points for McLaren. And then we see Hülkenberg in P8, Magnussen just outside the points in P11, but Hülkenberg still gaining points for Haas this weekend, so a very good points haul for Haas as a whole this weekend. And Liam Lawson, I will say, to be fair, I did say he wasn't picking up the slack, and he did gain 2 points for VCarb in P9. So
he did better than Tsunoda.
Yeah, I suppose that is fair. Tsunoda, to be fair, did have a penalty, but at the end of the day, Lawson is P9, and that is something. And then Colapinto in P10, so picking up another point for Williams, especially considering that Albon is P16. That's something.
I think that's another conversation to have about Alex Albon as well.
And then Bottas and Zhou, of course, back of the grid at 17th and 18th. Ocon splitting them in the middle in P18. Not a good weekend for them, but that's kind of every weekend.
Yeah.
So now I think I want to get into the recent news about the Haas and Toyota partnership.
Okay.
Haas with the Gazoo Racing partnership, I believe. I believe it's supposed to be a technical partnership. And I think that'll be really interesting to see as we go into the future. Toyota's sort of return to Formula One.
Yeah.
We haven't seen Toyota in a long time here in the Formula One world. And yeah, it's supposed to be a multi-year agreement.
Okay.
And there's not a ton of information, but we know it'll be a design, a technical, and manufacturing services.
Okay.
So I think that'll be interesting to see because, of course, Toyota has a lot of resources in that department that Haas probably doesn't have. We know Toyota has had a lot of success with their endurance program. They've been doing really good there in WEC, and they recently unveiled some new things, such as their new V10 Supra that will be competing in a couple of racing series. So we will see what they're able to do with the help of the GR program. Yeah. But, I mean, Haas has been doing good recently, and so hopefully the Toyota will only help them now.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the big news of the paddock is, unfortunately, Daniel Ricciardo's leave from Red Bull and Liam Lawson's entrance into the VCarb team.
I think the only unfortunate here is for most of his fans out there.
I think it's a little sad just at this race in particular because Ricciardo has such a weird affinity
for the United States,
especially Austin. Yeah. It is a little bit sad. It's a little unfortunate for them, for him at least. But at the end of the day, he wasn't performing, and I think you have to
really
try
bad.
something new.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's a little weird because it's like right at the end of the season,
Mm-hmm.
but they might be looking for some potential candidates for the Red Bull team next year.
Yeah. Well, we know that Lawson is the main candidate for that Red Bull spot if Perez is gone, which I don't understand still with Yuki Tsunoda still leading that V-Carb team.
Yeah, I'm not. It's a little strange, but we will see what happens from there. We will. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to cover, because I think we all love AO Racing. They were the champions of the GTD Pro Championship in IMSA Racing. Very exciting for them. Everyone's favorite endurance team. I mean, how could you not love AO Racing? Rexy has done it. They've won the championship in IMSA. It's very exciting for them, I would say. They ran a very good season. A couple wins in there. Added a couple gold teeth to Rexy. It was very exciting for them. They've made a lot of partnerships recently with some big companies. You got people like Hot Wheels, and now people are raving over these Rexy Hot Wheels. I mean, for good measure, they're nice Hot Wheels. Always, Rexy's just such a fun car. I don't know. How could you not love them?
Oh yeah.
But it's great for AO Racing, especially as a fairly new-ish team, a smaller team.
Yeah.
They're really making waves, and they've been doing a lot recently, so that's good for them. And yeah, I think that about wraps it up for us on this episode of Paddock and Track.
Yeah.
I hope you guys enjoyed, and we will see you for the next one.
Goodbye.